so today we're going to be talking about tetrapod and amphibian evolution and the subsequent colonization of land by early tetrapods. So here are some example species that just to highlight some of the unique organisms we'll be highlighting here today, including Anchathostega there in the middle, and then Triatobatrachus, one of the early known frogs. So quick fact for the day. There are some interesting organisms that are very, very, very small. We oftentimes focus on ones that are very large, such as the largest mammal, but here it's kind of a fun fact for the day. This one species, Phaedophryne, is the world's smallest known vertebrate. It was only recently described in 2012. It's from Papua New Guinea, and you can see it there on a coin relative to its size. It's a fly-like vertebrate that feeds mostly on mites. So that's actually not a juvenile, that's a full-grown adult. So just kind of keep that in mind if we think about sort of the evolution of frogs. There's a variety of sizes. So just kind of a fun fact for today. What we're going to be talking about include what is a tetrapod, and so what has the head of a crocodile and gills of a fish? Why is a certain important transitional fossil help us tell the story of the transition to land and the subsequent colonization of land? And we're going to give you an overview on amphibian evolution with some important other fossils. So what exactly is a tetrapod? Well, a tetrapod by its name, tetra meaning four, pod meaning foot. So a tetrapod by definition is really just a four-footed vertebrate that includes modern-day amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds, not fish. So humans are technically tetrapods. We are actually mammals, so we are tetrapods. And are snakes tetrapods? Technically, yes, even though they've lost their limbs evolutionarily as they evolved from lizards, they are still tetrapods. So let's travel back in time a little bit and focus more on the evolution of amphibians. And so I'll be highlighting some important amphibian fossils and also tetrapods. So when we think of early tetrapod evolution and the story of early amphibian evolution, we have to kind of consider the conditions of habitats during this time. The time being the age of fishes, also referred to as the Devonian, which occurred during the Paleozoic era. So we're talking roughly around 370 million years ago. What was going on in terrestrial and aquatic habitats? Well, we had a lot of shallow, swampy, freshwater habitats. And what was going on land? Well, on land, we have very primitive plants and a number of terrestrial invertebrates. So we do have a potential food source on land, right? But we don't have these vast forests like we do today. So kind of just to kind of set the scene here for the evolution of some of these tetrapods, some of these early amphibians I'm going to mention in the next couple slides. So the Devonian age is the age of fishes, right? Not Devo. Devo, if you don't know, is the band that wrote Whip It Good from the 80s. There is a rich history of Devonian fossils, a number of different vertebrates, predominantly a lot of what we know about the Devonian era. The reason it's called the age of the fishes is that we have a much greater fossil record for various different fishes of this time. Some of them had these really armed bony plates were kind of interesting. So a lot of kind of interesting fossils. We're not going to have time to focus on some of those, but just to kind of once again, hopefully this picture tells you a little bit of what's going on during the Devonian. It helps bring it more to life. So why land? Why colonize land? So it's thought that we had a number of periods where we actually had drying pools of water. And so it's thought that early tetrapods, early vertebrates that were colonizing land were potentially escaping habitats as we had less and less water, as you know what happens when a pond dries up. It's also thought that there was relatively low oxygen with warmer water. So on land, oxygen is plentiful. So that's another consideration for why land. Also, there is a number of food sources. So even though we don't have these vast forests like we do today in some areas, really on land it was primitive plants and a number of invertebrates, and so possibly less competition. So it's thought that a lot of vertebrates colonizing land were possibly also escaping predation in crowded waters. And so just some more factors when we think about why colonize land from an evolutionary perspective. Why do we see land being colonized by vertebrates and early tetrapods? The story of tetrapod evolution and the subsequent colonization of land is really one of the more significant events in our own vertebrate history when we start seeing fins of some lobe-finned fishes evolve gradually over millions of years, and some of the tetrapods I'll show you, into limbs and feet of tetrapods. So colonizing every habitat as they became more successful and adaptively radiated out over millions of years. However, keep in mind this caveat here is that many of what we know is only from a small subset of fossils, transitionary fossils, important fossils that help tell the story. But once again, the caveat, we don't know all the fossils. We don't have all the information, so we have to kind of piece it together. And I'll hopefully do that in these next three fossils I'll mention. So let's just focus briefly on some major features of early tetrapod evolution. What do we see changing morphologically as we think of this as early tetrapods colonizing land in this very different terrestrial environment versus an aquatic environment? So what has to happen? So for lungs, the first terrestrial feature to evolve, and this is thought to have possibly developed as an accessory structure to deal with low oxygen or anoxic conditions. Now, in terms of movement, movement is going to be very different on land than it is in water. So we need really to see the evolution of limbs evolving in water, but over time we see stronger skeletal support to help support the body and limbs to allow for movement on land. So movement on land is going to be a little bit different than movement in water. Anyone who's ever swum or gone to a pool recognizes this probably. Now, what about feeding? The last point here for major features of early tetrapod evolution. Feeding Tiktaalik had a neck, the one I'm going to mention here in a bit, and in both shallow water and on land, the ability to move your head actually confers a great advantage to capturing prey, possibly avoiding predation, but more importantly, to capture prey. So being able to look around and having an actual neck is going to be a huge evolutionary breakthrough that we see in early tetrapod evolution. And Tiktaalik is thought to be one of the first fossils that actually has a neck, an early tetrapod. What else do we need to see when we think about early tetrapods, colonization of land, and tetrapod evolution? We see some differences if we simply compare amphibian and fish skin. So we see 2 to 3 layers of epidermis covered by mucosal coat. So we see some similarities between fish and larval amphibians. However, once we see amphibians colonize land, early tetrapods evolving over millions of years, we start seeing the number of skin layers increase, as well as increased keratinization of the skin for protection or abrasion, even though most of us think of amphibians as sort of being in water and being able to subcutaneously exchange gases, etc. We do see a change over time in the number of skin layers. So that's kind of an important trait once again as we see movement from aquatic environments to more terrestrial environments in adult amphibians. And lastly here for the sense organs, if you think about if you've ever gone swimming underwater or you go to the bottom of a pool, how you hear and see is going to be very different, right? So how does sound travel underwater versus in the air? The same occurs in terms of the eyes. So we see a change in sense organs as we compare, let's say, fish to amphibians over the course of evolution and tetrapod evolution as they move from aquatic to terrestrial perception. So being able to see in air or terrestrial environments versus in aquatic environments. So that's just something else to keep in mind, some of the major trends and features for tetrapod evolution. So this just shows a basic phylogeny for some of the organisms we're going to talk about today. And really for comparison, if you think about what we talked about last time for content or reptile story of reptile evolution, reptiles tended to leave more fossils, right? We went into the different skull morphologies and really think about what happened 65 million years ago. So compare this to what we know about amphibians versus what we know about reptiles. So here is another phylogeny just showing you in terms of time frames, Devonian, the age of fishes there on the bottom left as you move forward in time through the Carboniferous to the Permian, all occurring during the Paleozoic era across these millions of years. And you look on the top moving down, you'll see a number of different trends that occur in early tetrapods moving forward to amphibians. So what do we see if you look at the right of this graph in terms of the ulna, the radius, and humerus? So what should kind of jut out at you is we start seeing essentially this story of fins evolving into limbs. And we also see an increased complexity in terms of the limbs and digits, even though we see some of the similar bones there. There are sort of over time with the cases of Anchathostega, Tiktaalik, and subsequently here Diprotodon, having a difference in terms of fins moving more to wrist and bones in the phalanges and supporting the phalanges. So kind of interesting if we just compare the bones across some of these transitional fossils to early fish moving forward in time. So during the Devonian period that we're sort of in right now, talking about the late Devonian lobe-finned fishes and amphibious tetrapods, here are some of the big players. We're going to learn about the top three here, Tiktaalik, in terms of when they occurred, Ichthyostega and Acanthostega. So for Ichthyostega and Acanthostega for a long time, that's really all we knew about early tetrapod evolution and subsequently amphibians. It isn't until more recently that Tiktaalik was discovered and helped piece together this story of the transition to a life on land for early tetrapods. We're going to focus on these three. So when we compare some features of tetrapod evolution to modern day tetrapods, right? What are our modern tetrapods? Once again, we have amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. They have some very specific adaptations. So we're talking once again about tetrapods, tetra, four, pod foot, four limbs, and feet with digits, as we see over evolutionary time. We see with the advent of Tiktaalik, the first example of a neck, which allows separate movement of the head, which is a great evolutionary breakthrough in adaptation. We start seeing the absence of gills mostly, right? There are some exceptions to this for larval amphibians. Also, once again, think about ears for detecting airborne sounds. Hearing in terrestrial environments and air is going to be very different than underwater. And when we have some examples of tetrapod evolution, it really tells the story of this transition from aquatic to terrestrial environments. And so we have some also transitional fossils that help tell the story of early fish to early amphibians. And so here are some examples we'll focus on Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. So for a good portion of time, we only really knew a little bit about early tetrapod evolution and early amphibian evolution by two fossils. These two fossils were Acanthostega on the left and Ichthyostega on the right. And so this is obviously before Tiktaalik was discovered, before it was described. Really, we only had two fossils to go on in terms of studying this. And so let's dwell a little bit deeper into these two fossils. So Acanthostega was one of the few early tetrapod species, as I mentioned, for many years, and it's the slightly less advanced example than Ichthyostega. And it had 8 digits, which actually differs from the modern plan we see in amphibians, which is the 4 to 5 plan. We'll learn more about that when we learn about modern day amphibians. But essentially, it had 8 digits and it had a very fish like shoulder. Now, Acanthostega possessed gills, and its ear is adapted for hearing in water. So, if you actually can look at the ear bones, you will see that it's adapted for life in water. And it probably made its way along the bottom, crawling over vegetation rather than doing much crawling on land. Now, the term Acanthostega corresponds to spiny roof. It's from the late Devonian, was discovered in Greenland or described from Greenland, and it dates from 365 million years ago. It had very primitive limbs, so it is able to navigate shallow water areas. And it's thought that the water during this time, its habitat consisted of largely aquatic plants and some woody debris, so hence those artistic renditions. Had actually well-defined digits, no wrist or ankle, and was thought to not be able to support much weight. So it was still muchly adapted to a life within these aquatic habitats. And did have an internal fish-like gills. Now the other fossil I'll mention here, Ichthyostega, from the late Devonian 370 million years ago. This fossil from Greenland, described in the 1930s, its term for its name, Ichthyostega, means roof fish, and was thought to be quite large, so 5 foot, 50 pounds. So we're talking about a very, very large early tetrapod. Actually had 7 digits instead of the modern 5 that we see. Had longer legs than Acanthostega. So if we're comparing Ichthyostega to Acanthostega, had longer legs, had 7 versus 8 digits, let's say. And some of the fish and amphibian features, it actually possessed webbed feet, and it's thought it had the ability to breathe air for short periods of time. And once again, this is kind of one of the secondary transitionary fossils, early tetrapods of this time. And these first tetrapods, it wasn't until the early 2000s. So once again, what we knew about early tetrapod evolution, early amphibian evolution, was really described from these two fossils, Anchathostega, Ichthyostega. These are the first true tetrapods. However, subsequently, Tiktaalik, also considered a transitional fishapod tetrapod, came on the scene, was discovered more recently, relatively recently, than Anchathostega and Ichthyostega. So let's focus a little bit on Tiktaalik. So some of you may have heard of Tiktaalik before from another course. So let's review for those of you who haven't. Tiktaalik rosea was discovered in 2004, 2006 in terms of it being described. It's from the Devonian period, so about the same time frame there, 375 million years, predating some of these other ones. It's an early tetrapod transitional fossil, so it links lobe-finned fish to amphibians, or modern-day amphibians. And it had some very important characteristics of fish that included gills, scales, and fins, while also having some important characteristics or traits of amphibians, having largely a flattened head, eyes and nostril on the dorsal or the back, and also possessing a neck. So that's a great evolutionary adaptation, Tiktaalik being able to have a neck. It's thought to be a land invader because we start seeing, if we compare this to those other transitional fossils, the presence of more sturdy ribs and actually bones in the fins. Now, the story of the discovery of Tiktaalik is a really interesting story. So Neil Shubin has a series online and a great book about this, and so I'll have a link for some of these videos. But it really tells the story of this missing link, if you will, for lack of a better term, where they were looking for the same geological era where they might find an early tetrapod. They stumbled upon one, got very lucky, described it, and hence we have now Tiktaalik helping to tell the story, in addition to some of the other transitional fossils of early tetrapods. So Tiktaalik had some other important traits, such as a mobile neck and ear structure that allowed Tiktaalik to move its head and hear both in and out of water to find prey. So kind of an important evolutionary breakthrough once again for hearing on land in an air environment versus underwater. And also here in the bottom, the presence of articulating wrist and an elbow along with these chest muscles, which are thought to have allowed Tiktaalik to move onto land and kind of do these early push-ups, if you will, to move out of these aquatic environments and actually spend some time on land before returning to the water. So kind of a very important transitional fossil. And so here are some more important traits that we see in Tiktaalik and more reason as to why it's a very important transitional fossil that helps us tell the story of early tetrapod evolution and its colonization of land. Here is a close-up showing those fish characteristics and tetrapod or early amphibian characteristics here in the actual fossil. So you can see they're possessing of gills and lungs, actually had fish scales and fins, whereas some of the amphibian traits are what we call tetrapod characters, having a neck, being able to rotate its head, huge advantage there, having ribs, the supported internal anatomy, and actually having eyes on top of the skull, a relatively flat skull. So some important traits there that we see, as well as the wrist there on the right. So in this important Tiktaalik transitional fossil. So I'll have some videos on Tiktaalik. I highly recommend. Most of you have probably been exposed to Tiktaalik for better or for worse. I really like Tiktaalik. I really like asking questions about Tiktaalik on exams. So I would go and review Tiktaalik and understand why it's an important transitional fossil, how it helps tell the story of amphibian evolution. And there's some really great videos that I have on Canvas that are really interesting for learning more about Tiktaalik. So take a moment to watch those videos and perhaps take some notes. So what's the dealio with tetrapods? So Tiktaalik is an important fishapod transitional fossil. Those other two fossils in reviewing here, Anchathostega and Ichthyostega, had limbs of the earliest tetrapods, but they were not really adapted well for walking on land, more for walking on water. But for the longest time, we only had those two fossils, Anchathostega and Ichthyostega, to help tell the story. That's why Tiktaalik was such an important discovery, and its description of the traits it has also help us understand the colonization of land by tetrapods. So when we think about these early tetrapods, they behave much like modern-day salamanders, spending most of their time in water and only occasionally emerging on land. So once again, they really weren't capable of doing these long migrations or spending a great deal of time on land. But at the same time spending some percentage of their time on land where there's a whole new food source, right? Oxygen isn't a limiting factor if these stream or these areas that are aquatic are drying up or having potentially lower oxygen. Land for much of this period of time is sort of this huge resource that's untapped for from the vertebrate perspective. And so that's kind of the reason why tetrapods and their evolution and colonization of land is so important to herpetology, but also to the story of vertebrates. So many of these transitional forms help us tell the story of vertebrate evolution, subsequent amphibian evolution, and tetrapods. But once again, this caveat here that there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge, right? There could be a discovery 10 years from now or 30 years from now that helps tell the story in a better light. So just keep that in mind for in terms of fossils. So as we transition from talking about transitional tetrapod fossils, when we think about modern amphibians or the list amphibia they're often referred to, we're obviously talking about frogs, salamanders, and the lesser studied, lesser known caecilians. So we'll be focusing more on these in our subsequent lectures, learning more about these various groups of amphibians. So of course, modern amphibians consist of salamanders and their various different orders here. So we're in the class Amphibia. We have these orders here. So essentially for salamanders and caecilians, I'm going to make you familiar with one or two, but just basically pick one. And so I'll probably pick one as well to go with, but just the caveat there that these are sort of terms that are interchangeable. So the class Amphibia, but those orders, you may see salamander order being Urodela or Caudata, same as caecilians, Apoda or Gymnophiona, and frogs luckily are essentially in the order Neura. So there's not a whole lot of terminology change there. Just be aware of that as we get into these different amphibian groups moving forward in the course. Some derived features of amphibians that we're going to focus on here as we're sort of telling the story of why these tetrapods are important. What do we start seeing in modern day amphibians? Well, we start seeing what are called pedicellate teeth. These are teeth with a long base. Some derived features we see in modern day amphibians. We see amphibian papillae or a unique ear structure, so in terms of hearing. We see also over time for many amphibian groups a reduction in the number of skull bones, so we see fusion of various different skull bones. We also start seeing shorter ribs, so less ribs, shorter ribs over the course of evolution of amphibians as a group. And we also start seeing this ability for amphibians to breathe through their skin and have gas exchange occurring through their skin. Other traits that we see for amphibians that are derived, we start seeing a unique mechanism for sight. So unique retinal photoreceptors. These are green rods we're seeing in the blue spectrum. Other vertebrates have different formats, so they have red rods. So we start seeing this within the group Amphibia. We also start seeing a flexible neck. We start seeing what's called the levator bulbi muscle. These actually kind of push the eyes out of the head. So there's some examples there where most of us think of certain groups of amphibians. Why is that the case? It's from the levator bulbi muscle, and that might become apparent if you're talking about eyesight and having that as an adaptation in its environment, sort of in these aquatic habitats perhaps. And then lastly, some more derived features here for the group or the class Amphibia at large, having hands with this 4 to 5 number sequence with hands with 4 digits and feet with 5 digits, mostly. There are some exceptions to this, but by and large, most amphibians have 4 digits on their hands, 5 on their foot, but once again, there are some exceptions to this. So it's kind of the 4-5 rule. Now let's focus a little bit about evolution within one of our groups we'll become more familiar with, Anura or frogs. So what are some trends that we see if we examine the evolutionary story of the order Anura or frogs? So if you look at this figure here on the right, what are some traits that we see? We see modifications overall for jumping and hopping within the order Anura or frogs. We see a shortening of the vertebral column. We see a loss of ribs and a loss of tail in adults. We also see within the skull, as shown here on the right, overall widening of the skull and overall enlarging of the orbits, right? So in terms of the eye there. So you should hopefully see that on the top of this figure on the right in terms of just focusing on the skull. So it becomes more wide over time, and we see those orbits enlarging over time as we move from left to right, from early frogs to later frogs on the right. So as to the first point for the evolution of Anura or frogs, what do we see here in terms of the rest of the skeleton, not just the skull? What do we see moving left to right as we go from different early groups to later ones? We start seeing fusion of various different skeletal elements. We start seeing overall a decrease in the number of ribs, right? So you should be able to see that if you look at the center here, Gerobatrachus and Tratobatrachus, early frog examples. To the right, modern day rana or modern day true frogs, right? So there are some differences there, but not just in the skull, but also in terms of the morphology of various different skeletal structures as well. So you should be able to, if you look at this, let's say you're not sure about, what a modern day frog is, it's been a while since you dissected it, you should still be able to look at this figure, let's say, look at the skull, look at the skeletal structures there. What do you see? What are some differences? So pick out 2 or 3 differences in skeletal morphology from the center, Gerobatrachus and Tritobatrachus, to on the right there, modern day rana. So take a look at this. You should be able to at minimal point out a few differences between early amphibians, early anurans versus more modern day amphibians or frogs, anurans. We start seeing a number of other traits for elongation, for hopping, jumping, ribs, eyes, reduction of head bones, etc. So there's a number of features that should jump out at you if you compare from left to right. So one example of an early anuran or early frog is Amphibians. Now, this is from the late Carboniferous, about 300 million years ago. It means Greek for equal legs, Amphibians, and it's actually thought to have inhabited swamps from Europe and North America. It was relatively small. Amphibians was only thought to be about 6 inches, few ounces, so relatively small early frog. And it had a large number of presacral vertebrae. So overall, a large number of vertebrae still present in this early frog Amphibians. Now here's another example of an early frog, which dates to a little more recently and more recently described. And of course, recently, 2008, may seem like a long time ago, but still relatively recently in terms of fossil discoveries. It's from the early Permian, so moving forward about 209 million years ago. From Texas, this is thought to be kind of more the term for what is called a frogmander. So Gerobatrachus is often referred to as a frogmander because it kind of looks like a frogmander if you look at it morphologically. So it's thought to have a mixture of salamander and frog traits. It had 2 fused ankle bones. It had an intermediate backbone. It had a very large tympanum, so the hearing eardrum, external eardrum for hearing that you see in modern day frogs, and a relatively wide frog-like skull. Now, Gerobatrachus is likely a transitional form of amphibian or neuron or frog, and it's thought that there was a splitting between what led to modern day frogs and modern day salamanders somewhere in the realm of 240 to 275 million years ago. Once again, not a great fossil record for this period of time. So really, one of our more important early frogs is what's called Tratobatrachus. So Tratobatrachus is from the early Triassic period, so moving forward here, or back, if you will, from now. 250 million years ago, discovered from Madagascar or described from Madagascar. It refers to as triple frog or proto frog. And it's thought to be really the first frog fossil, Tratobatrachus. If we look at Tratobatrachus in more detail here, it occurs a number of years before the next frog fossil I'll talk about, Varela, had a relatively small body, so very small. SVL just means standard vent length, so relatively small, 10 centimeters. Had relatively stubby tail, so it did possess a tail, and it had elongated legs, and really lacked a shortened trunk, so it had a number of presacral vertebrae, so it still had a larger number of presacral vertebrae than modern day frogs. So let's examine briefly the skeletal morphology of Tratobatrachus, the first thought to be proto or first true frog. What are some traits that we see if we look at the skeletal morphology of Tratobatrachus versus modern day frogs? Well, think about overall body plan here, the skeletal morphology, kind of a long frog, right? And so overall, we see 14 presacral vertebrae versus the smaller number in modern day frogs. What else do we see? We see that the urostyle is absent, so there's some skeletal morphological traits that are not present here relative to modern day frogs, including the urostyle, and a relatively short ilium. So we don't really see this great elongated structures for hopping or jumping quite yet. And of course, the tail. And so even though there are some exceptions to this rule, there is a frog family that actually has a tail, but for the most part, juveniles or larvae absorb their tail and don't have tails as adults, whereas Trotobatrachus is thought to have still had a tail as an adult. So some more differences in terms of Trotobatrachus, this early frog, versus modern day frogs. And so once again here, Trotobatrachus had 14 vertebrae relative to the 9 seen in modern day frogs, or sorry, pre-sacral vertebrae. And actually it lacked a fused pectoral girdle, elongate ilium, and urostyle. So we don't really see some of those trends that we see in the skeletal morphology of modern day frogs, essentially for an adaptation lifestyle for hopping or jumping. So not quite in play here for this early frog Trotobatrachus if you compare some of the skeletal morphology to modern day frogs. Also, the orbits are in fact enlarged, and once again, presence of the tail. Now, another example of an early frog dating much later than Trotobatrachus is Varela. And so Varela is from the early Jurassic period, about 200 million years ago, so we're still moving forward in time. Or if you want to travel back in time, 200 million years. So moving forward from Trotobatrachus to Varela, discovered from Argentina, it's thought to be the earliest true frog. So Trotobatrachus is kind of thought to be the earliest frog. Varela is really thought to be the earliest true frog. And so it may belong to a modern day family, Leopelmatidae, and it has a typical classic frog-like head and relatively large eyes. So relatively looks kind of like a modern day frog. And actually we do start seeing in Varela legs modified for jumping that we see in modern day frogs. So here's a really good comparison of what I'm talking about for Trotobatrachus, this early proto-frog, versus what's thought to be the earliest true frog, Varela. And so overall, you see a reduction of vertebrae if you compare left and right. Overall body length is truncated, right? So shortened. And then on the right, you see with Varela the presence of an urostyle and a tibiofibula. And so we see these elongated, almost like having two different knees, if you will, rotating. We see some modifications of skeletal morphology that we see also in modern day frogs. And so those missing components there are missing components of this one particular fossil. But just some comparative differences between the earliest proto-frog, Trotobatrachus on the left, and on the right, Varela, what's thought to be the earliest true frog. So be able to kind of look at these two differences and point these out and kind of talk about them. So what do we know about primitive salamanders? So what do we know about early salamanders? So we've talked a little bit now about reptiles. We've talked a little bit now about early frogs. What do we know about early salamanders? So here is one of our only really relatively good examples for early salamander, Carosus. And so Carosus, if you look at the fossil there on the left and the ensuing skeletal morphology on the right, if you look at the morphology here, it kind of looks like maybe a broad or wide head salamander, kind of relatively similar body, a little bit different, maybe more stout bodied, but the head looks very different than most modern day salamanders. And so we know a lot less about the story of salamander evolution than we do about frog evolution. And so let's talk a little bit about Carosus. And so Carosus is from the late Jurassic period, so moving forward, if you will, 150 million years ago, from the swamps of Russia, and it's recognized as really the first salamander fossil. Relatively small, a few ounces, 8 inches, had that very broad triangular shaped head, so very different than modern day salamanders, and had upward pointed eyes. So in terms of where its orbicularis ora or its eye orbit was, a little bit different, upward pointing eyes than modern day salamanders. Had relatively primitive skull structure, and it's thought to really be more of an intermediate salamander between terrestrial and aquatic environments. We have modern day salamanders as either larvae or adults. You can oftentimes have them in forested areas versus only a handful being fully aquatic. Most of them as adults live in forest or transition to land. And so Caruso's from the Jurassic is really thought to be this fossil, an intermediate between terrestrial and aquatic habitats, having some of these characteristics in its morphology, relatively stout limbs, kind of that stout kind of body, short trunk, and kind of resembles modern day hellbenders in hyoid structure and bomber teeth. And so it has some traits that make it kind of look like a modern day hellbender. And so kind of interesting. We don't know a lot about early salamander evolution, and there's not a whole lot of fossils relative to some of the other groups. This is kind of the one that we kind of have to go with, Corysus. Now, what do we know about caecilians? What do we know about primitive caecilians? Our last group within amphibia. So much like modern day natural history, we know very little about caecilians at large. Modern times, we know very little about the origin of caecilians or their evolutionary history. So very little is known about caecilians in terms of fossils or their evolution. There's really only two primary fossils, Apodops and Eocaecilia, one of which we only know from a single vertebrae. So not a lot to go on, but let's just briefly talk about early caecilians. So Eocaecilia, one example from the early Jurassic period, discovered from Arizona, dating to about 200 million years ago. It's referred to as the dawn caecilian, resembles modern day caecilians, right, our last group within Amphibia, the class. So caecilian having a worm-like body, about 6 inches long, relatively small. Lower jaw is identical to modern day caecilians, why it's called Eocaecilian or dawn caecilian, and had presence of a sensory organ or tentacle. So we'll learn more about that as we learn about caecilians. Once again, not a lot to go on in terms of the fossil record of this group, very less studied, even in terms of modern natural history. Fossil record very scant and few and far between. This fossil did have four limbs, which is lost in modern day forms. And so, kind of like an example of Najash with snakes, we see here the same kind of story at play, whereas caecilians became increasingly fossorial or ground dwelling. Over evolutionary time, they lost their limbs. And so they were a tetrapod, they still are a tetrapod, but modern day caecilians don't have front or right limbs. They have no limbs. So they kind of look more like an eel or more like a snake or a worm, but they're essentially are a tetrapod and they've lost those limbs over time. And so this fossil is important in telling the story of caecilian evolution because it has those four limbs, which are lost in modern day caecilians. So once again, there are gaps in our knowledge for many of these groups of amphibians, many of these tetrapods, and as we get new information in science in general, we have to kind of readjust what we know. So like I said, if there may be a fossil in a museum right now, 10 years from now, there may be a new fossil, transitional fossil, helps tell the story a little bit better. And so there's still a lot of gaps in our knowledge for the fossil record for less or so for reptiles, but really more at play for amphibians. So now what? So I'll end the lecture here today. So basically just go back and look at some of the learning outcomes or study guides. And so what are tetrapods? What is Tiktaalik? What is Encathostega and Ichthyostega? Tell me some traits of tetrapods. How is life in an aquatic environment different than life on land? What do we see in the evolutionary history of amphibians? Some of the derived characteristics or traits that we start seeing over time. Can you compare Tritobatrachus to Varela? These early frogs. What's an early salamander? What's an early caecilian? Tell me a little bit about that, and compare and contrast some of these early amphibians as we kind of start learning more about our amphibian groups. With that, have a great day.